She belongs to me now. The blood stops here. Not because of any oath your family swore, but because I decided to take what I want. And I want her. The private airstrip outside the city was the kind of place where debts were paid in silence and secrets were buried beneath the tarmac. Zara stood in the middle of it all, her dark brown skin luminous even beneath the cold industrial lights, her natural coils pulled back like a crown she hadn't asked to wear. She wasn't a resolution inked onto paper. She was a girl handed over like contraband to settle a debt that had been her father's sin and was now her sentence. The air tasted of aviation fuel and something colder, something that had nothing to do with the hour. On the far side of the hangar, leaning against the hood of a matte black car with the ease of a man who had never once questioned his right to occupy space, stood Kael Jeon. He looked nothing like the ghost story her father had been whispering to her since childhood. He was too real for that, too precise, too sharp around the edges. Dressed in a slate-colored suit with no tie, and the collar open just enough to show the first curl of black ink against his throat, he looked like danger that had learned how to dress itself. When he pushed off the car and walked toward her, the hangar seemed to contract. His pace was unhurried, each footfall deliberate, as though the world had agreed in advance to wait for him. When he stopped, the distance between them was barely enough for a breath, and Zara caught his scent before anything else, not smoke, not sweat, but dark amber and cold cedar, the kind of smell that belonged to someone who had never once been desperate. His hand came up slowly, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw as if he were mapping something he already owned. His skin was unexpectedly warm. She had prepared herself for cold. "She belongs to me now," Kael said, his voice low and rough, the kind of quiet that was louder than shouting. "The blood stops here, not because of any oath your family swore, but because I decided to take what I want. And I want her. If a single hand reaches for her, if a single eye lingers a moment too long, I will dismantle everything you've spent your life building, brick by brick, until there is nothing left but dust and regret." Her father didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Kael's hand dropped to the small of her back, steering her toward the waiting car with the quiet authority of a man who had already closed the chapter. The door sealed behind them with a sound like finality. The university campus in early autumn was the kind of beautiful that made you believe nothing bad could ever happen there. Zara crossed the main quad with her bag slung over one shoulder, the morning light pulling copper and gold from her skin, her curls loose and catching the breeze. She looked like freedom. She did not feel like it. She was aware of them the way you're aware of a fever, not always visible, but always present. The men Kael had stationed around the perimeter of her life, watching, reporting, making sure the world understood that the radius around her was occupied. She had learned to move through it, to perform normalcy while the invisible walls hummed around her. "Zara, hey!" Marcus, a classmate from her international law seminar, jogged to catch up with her, clutching a folder of printed readings. His smile was open and easy, entirely unaware of what standing beside her meant. "You missed the symposium on Tuesday. I saved you the notes." Before her hand could even extend toward the folder, the air changed. It didn't announce itself with a sound. It announced itself the way a storm does, in the sudden stillness of everything else. A black SUV materialized at the edge of the walkway, its engine idling at a frequency that felt less like noise and more like a warning. The rear window descended 2 inches. Kael didn't step out. He simply appeared in that gap, his eyes settling on Marcus with the flat, dispassionate attention of someone cataloging a problem. The tattoo at his collar was stark in the daylight. Marcus's smile evaporated. His posture changed in a single second from casual to something close to prey. "I'll just, Marcus set the folder on the nearest bench as though it had burned him. "Leave these here." He was gone before Zara could speak. She turned toward the car, chin lifted. Kael's expression didn't shift. He simply beckoned her with one slow curl of his finger, and against every instinct that told her to stay exactly where she was, she walked to him. He reached through the open window, his thumb dragging a slow, deliberate line along the shell of her ear, a gesture that was less tenderness and more territory. "Go to your lectures," he murmured, his voice like gravel over silk. "But remember, every man watching you is imagining something he will never be permitted. I don't loan what I own." She wanted to tell him he was suffocating her. She wanted to say that she was a person, not a possession, that ownership was a concept that ended the moment it started. But his hand cupped her jaw and tilted her face toward his, and his mouth brushed the corner of hers so softly it almost felt like a question, and the words dissolved before they ever reached her lips. She walked into her lecture hall with his eyes at her back, heavier and more present than any chain. The lecture hall was built like a coliseum, tiered rows curving down to the professor's floor. Zara sat near the back, alone inside a ring of empty seats that no one had touched since the story of the quad spread through campus overnight. She was untouchable, and everyone knew it. She had become, without ever agreeing to it, a monument surrounded by invisible fence wire. Professor Dane was the kind of academic who wore authority like a cologne, applied too heavily, designed to be noticed. He was mid-lecture on the history of leveraged coercion when his gaze found Zara and lingered. He was a man who had always taken attention as his due, who had never once needed to consider whether his attention was wanted. He began to climb the tiered stairs toward her with the ease of someone who had done this before. "Ms. Ackhafer," he said, stopping at her row, his hand dropping onto the back of the empty chair beside her. Too close. The smell of stale coffee and self-importance closed around her. "Your written analysis on soft power was exceptional. I'd love to hear you expand on coercive leverage, the kind that operates outside formal channels." The way he said it made the words feel like they had nothing to do with political science. The double doors at the back of the hall did not open so much as explode. They hit the walls with a crack that silenced every whisper in the room and brought every head up from every notebook. Kael Jeon walked in with two men flanking him who looked carved from the same material as consequence. His jacket was gone, the dark, detailed ink of his forearms visible below rolled sleeves. His face was a glacier, composed and absolute, and his eyes went immediately to Dane with the kind of focus that made the air feel thin. The room stopped breathing. Kael didn't speak to the class. He didn't acknowledge the rows of frozen students. He walked directly to the professor, stopping so close that Dane had to resist the urge to step back and failed. Kael's hand closed around the man's wrist with a grip that dropped Dane half an inch in height. "She is here to learn," Kael said, his voice stripped of everything but the threat at its center. "Not to be an audience for whatever performance you mistake for mentorship. If you enter her orbit again for any reason that isn't academic, I will teach you, personally, what coercive leverage actually feels like." Dane nodded with his whole body. "Of course, I apologize, absolutely." Kael released him. Then, as if the entire room hadn't just watched a man's authority be removed from him like a coat, he turned his attention to Zara with an expression so different it was almost disorienting. His knuckles grazed her cheek. His thumb rested, just briefly, on her lower lip. "Keep studying," he said quietly. "You are exactly where you are supposed to be." He was gone, before the hall remembered how to breathe. The penthouse sat above the city like a declaration. Floor-to-ceiling glass on every side, the skyline stretched out below like something Kael had acquired along with everything else. The space was all clean stone and dark metal and deliberately chosen silence, but every surface had been softened. The throw on the sofa, the light above the reading chair, the collection of books that had appeared on the shelf beside her bed in exactly the genres she favored. The cage had been furnished to her precise specifications. That was almost the worst part. Zara sat at the window with her textbook open and unread, watching her own reflection in the darkening glass. The city glittered 40 floors below like a life she could see but not touch. She was aware of every sensor, every camera, every notification that pulsed to Kael's phone when she moved from room to room. She was not surveilled. She was documented. There was a difference she couldn't quite articulate and couldn't quite dismiss. The elevator sounded. Then the door. Then the familiar gravity of him, the way the air pressure seemed to shift when Kael Jeon entered a room, as if the space recalibrated to accommodate the weight of who he was. He didn't call out. He shed his jacket in the entryway and crossed to her without detour, sinking onto the sofa beside her and pulling her into his lap in one continuous motion, as though she were an extension of him that he needed to locate at the end of every day. His hands, scarred and ink-mapped and practiced in violence, moved through her hair with a gentleness that never failed to catch her off guard. He pressed his face to the curve of her neck and exhaled, long and slow, the tension of whatever the day had held leaving his body in a single breath. "You had the chamomile tonight," he murmured against her skin, "not the green tea." Zara stilled. "You're monitoring what I drink now." "I'm monitoring everything that keeps you well," he said, unapologetic, his grip firming just slightly. Not possessive, anchoring. The distinction was finer than she was comfortable admitting. She should have pushed back. She should have felt the weight of it like a hand at her throat. But his thumb moved to her wrist and rested there, not checking her pulse so much as counting it, owning the rhythm of it, and she felt something in her chest that she was not ready to name. Out there, the world was fractured and loud and indifferent. In here, she was the only fixed point on his horizon. He pulled back to look at her, and for a moment the mask slipped just enough to show what lived underneath. Something urgent and barely controlled. Something that looked less like domination and more like terror at the thought of losing her. "The campus is a compromise," he said quietly. "I let you have it because I want you to choose to come back. But understand this, if you stop choosing, I won't stop wanting. I will never stop wanting." He leaned in, his lips a breath from hers, and the air between them pulled taut. "That should frighten you more than it does." She reached up and pressed her palm flat against the tattoos on the side of his neck. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't move away. Imani arrived on a Thursday with a bottle of wine and the easy warmth of a friendship that had survived 2 years and a continent between them. Zara had wanted something that felt normal, something that felt like before, the kind of afternoon that had nothing in it except laughter and carelessness. She had forgotten that nothing in her life was like before anymore. Imani sat on the cream sectional, heels tucked beneath her, looking around the penthouse with eyes that cycled through awe and unease in a loop. "It's beautiful," she said carefully, "in the way that very expensive prisons are beautiful." Zara laughed, and it sounded more real than anything she'd produced in weeks. "That's exactly what it is." The elevator opened. Kael stepped out with his collar open and his sleeves pushed back, and Imani's easy posture reorganized itself into something much more careful. He was, Zara knew, startling to look at if you hadn't been looking at him for weeks, something assembled from controlled danger and too many sharp angles to ever fully relax around. Zara stood. "Kael, this is Imani. She's my oldest friend." And then something happened that Zara hadn't anticipated. Kael looked at Imani, and instead of the glacial indifference he offered most of the world, he paused. He walked toward them with measured courtesy and asked Imani something about her graduate research, his voice at a register Zara had never heard it in, open, attentive, almost warm. Imani's cheeks colored. She leaned forward. She laughed. Zara went to get water. In the kitchen, her hands gripped the counter and refused to let go. She told herself she was glad. She told herself this was good, this was normal, this was what she had wanted him to be for months. But when she turned the corner and saw them through the open living room, Kael leaning slightly toward Imani, Imani's chin tilted up and her eyes bright with that specific kind of attention, something cold and furious detonated in Zara's chest. She didn't want him to be warm, not for anyone else. She had spent weeks resisting the version of him that burned everything else to ash and saw only her, and now that he was performing something approaching humanity for another woman, she wanted to snatch it back. She set the glasses down on the counter with a crack. "Imani," her voice came out harder than she meant, flatter, final. "It's getting late. Your car is probably downstairs." Imani looked between them, reading the room with the intelligence that had always been her most distinct quality. She stood without argument. "Of course. Thank you for having me." She squeezed Zara's arm at the door and said nothing else. The elevator closed. The silence that returned was not empty. It was charged. Kael stood in the middle of the living room, watching her, and the expression on his face was not confusion. It was satisfaction so dark and complete it looked almost cruel. He already knew. He had known before she had. "You ended it early," he said, just that. Zara stepped into the room, her pulse loud in her own ears. "I don't want her here." "You've been asking me for months to be civilized." "Not with her." She crossed the distance between them until she was standing inside his shadow, her fingers knotting into the front of his shirt and pulling him down to her level. Not with anyone. I want the version of you that the whole city is afraid of. I want the version that has never once looked at anyone the way you look at me. Don't be hospitable. Don't be human for them. Save all of it, every terrible, consuming piece of it for me. Something shifted in his eyes, dark and triumphant and barely leashed. His hand came up around the back of her neck, and his grip was firm enough to tilt her face up. "Careful what you call for," he said. His voice dropped to something rough and low. "If you want the monster, you don't get to be surprised when he refuses to let you go." "I'm not surprised," she said. "I'm asking." The kiss was nothing like the careful, deliberate ones he usually offered her, calculated and controlled, and designed to leave her room to retreat. This one had no room in it at all. It tasted like possession and the very specific grief of wanting something you've been fighting against. He lifted her and she wrapped around him, and the glass of the city glittered 40 floors below, indifferent and infinite. While above it, Zara finally stopped pretending she was anything other than exactly where she had chosen to be. In the reflection of the window, she caught a glimpse of herself and didn't look away. Not a captive, not a treaty, something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for yet, but was beginning to understand. The night after felt like a held breath extended into morning. Zara sat in the back of the car on the way to campus, the city blurring past the window, her thoughts too slow and her body too aware of every place his hands had been. She was not the same girl who had stood on that airstrip. She wasn't sure yet if that was grief or relief. She was cutting through the east garden of campus, her bag over her shoulder, when the silver car jumped the curb. It happened fast, the way violence always does when it's been planned in advance. 2 men, not Kael's, their clothes tactical and deliberate, their faces carrying the flat affect of people who had stopped personalizing their work. One of them said her name in a voice that confirmed he had said it before, in briefings, in plans, in the arithmetic of leverage. "Ms. Ockhafer, Shen would like to extend an invitation. He feels a woman of your particular value has been, shall we say, misallocated." Shen, the name landed like a stone dropped in cold water. The rival who had made the war her father couldn't survive. The man whose hunger had started all of this long before she had ever been written into the equation. She didn't answer. There was a crash of metal and glass before the answer was needed. Kael's car hit the silver sedan like a judgment, slamming it sideways and crumpling the door on the driver's side in a sound that students 3 buildings away would remember for weeks. He was out before the vehicle stopped moving, and he was not the man she had fallen asleep beside the previous night. He was the original thing, the one the stories were built around, moving with a fluid and terrifying purpose across the garden path. He took the first man by the collar and introduced him to the stone wall of the library with the quiet efficiency of someone settling an old account. The second retreated. Kael let him, because the message was already delivered. Then he turned, his chest rising and falling, his knuckles split and bleeding freely, and his eyes found her across the distance with an expression that was nothing like the cold inventory she had been catalogued with on that airstrip months ago. This was something rower, something that looked like the specific desperation of a man who had just remembered what losing meant. He crossed to her in 3 strides. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He pulled her against him, his blood printing onto the white of her sleeve, his arms an enclosure that was both cage and armor in the same gesture. "Now you see," he said against her hair, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. "The walls aren't about control. They are about this, keeping the world from deciding you are available to anyone who wants you badly enough. They look at you and see an asset. I look at you and I see the only thing I would burn everything else down to protect. If they take you, there is nothing left of me that is worth keeping." Zara pressed her palm over the tattoo at his chest and felt his heartbeat, fast and unguarded, beneath the ink. She didn't pull away. Graduation morning arrived clear and indifferent to everything it meant. Zara walked across the stage in her academic gown, her diploma cool in her hands, her face composed in the way of someone who has rehearsed composure until it became the truth. She looked, to anyone watching, like a woman who had simply finished a degree. Her eyes went first, as they always did now, to the car idling at the far edge of the campus lawn, and to the figure behind the glass who watched her cross the stage with an attention so complete and unbroken it felt, even at this distance, like a hand at the small of her back. The war her father had started and couldn't finish was gone. Kael had not negotiated its end or outlasted it. He had removed it, with the kind of cold finality that left no residue, no loose threads, no rivals waiting in corners. What remained was only the two of them, and the particular, unusual piece of being the sole fixed object in the orbit of a man who had chosen to organize his entire existence around her survival. She descended the steps, turned her back on the faculty and the applause and the life she had been living before the airstrip, and walked toward the car. The door opened before she reached it. The interior smelled of dark amber and cedar, familiar now in the way of home, in the way of a scent that had printed itself onto the inside of something she couldn't quite name. Kael looked at her in the way he always did now, without inventory, without the cold appraisal of acquisition. He looked at her the way a man looks at the thing he has admitted to himself he cannot live without. "You're finished here," he said. His voice, rougher than usual, as if the morning had cost him something too. He reached for her. She came to him without hesitation. No more lecture halls. No more borrowed normalcy. No more pretending she wanted the world more than she wanted this. She leaned into his side as the car pulled away from the campus gates, one hand resting over the ink on his forearm, feeling the steady and slightly too fast beat of the pulse at his wrist. The city opened ahead of them, enormous and indifferent and entirely theirs. She had been sold to end a war. She had stayed to build something neither of them had a clean word for yet, something that looked from the outside like captivity and felt from the inside like the only place she had ever been entirely known. The gates disappeared behind them. She didn't look back. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Drop a comment below and tell me, did Zara make the right choice? I want to hear everything you think. See you in the next one.